Hello, my name is Aino Corry. I'm here to talk to you about retrospectives, why they work and sometimes don't work. I'm here to tell you about retrospectives antipatterns. My background is in computer science. I was originally educated as a researcher in computer science with focus on programming languages, but the past 15 years I've been facilitating retrospectives instead. So why this talk about retrospectives? Well, because when people think about retrospectives, unfortunately, there are some people who hate them. I would like you to be able to create retrospectives and facilitate retrospectives where people get happy when they hear there's a new retrospective. And also, I want to tell you about the goblin. So these are my two goals with this talk. First, I want to talk about what I mean when I say retrospective. To me, a retrospective is a recurring event in a team where they have the chance to reflect on what happened, get together and share the experiences they had and what actually happened so that they can understand that, okay, so we finished with this or we did not finish with this. There's always some surprises when you're sharing. And then you appreciate, and I don't just mean appreciating the good things, but also appreciating the bad things that happen during the work in the project or on a product. And then the last thing that's important in a retrospective is that you learn from the retrospective, because that is the way that you sell it to management. You're saying that the retrospectives we have will improve the way that we work together. And then, as my late father used to say, to understand everything is to forgive everything. And that's one of the most important things that I see in retrospectives, is that we try to understand why things happened instead of just finding a scapegoat and pointing them out. If we look at examples of what you can learn in a retrospective, I would pull out 3. One of them was the preparation for a meeting. I was facilitating a retrospective for some managers in a company, and they had some issues. And one of the issues that they had were that the one who invited in the calendar to the manager meetings expected that people would read the invitation to the meeting and prepare accordingly. So if they were asked to present something to their teams and come back with answers, it was expected that they did that. For the other managers, they didn't actually work like that. They would get up in the morning, and for each hour in the day, they would look at what meeting they had to go to, and they would not prepare. So they had been discussing this for a while, and the one who was inviting the meetings had assumed that when she said that this was her expectation, people would change the way that they worked. The other people, on the other hand, assumed that when they told her that they weren't the types that would prepare for a meeting, she would not expect them to prepare. And what happened in the retrospective was that they shared both understandings of the discussions they had, and they appreciated the viewpoint from the others, and they learned that they needed to have some firmer rules and do things in a little bit different way. So one of the action points that they had was that whenever they were invited to a management meeting, there would be an extra email that said preparation, please do this, read this, perform this before the meeting. Another learning that I saw in a retrospective was when a very unexperienced person started in a back-end team, and he was tasked with a part of the system that he needed to update, and everybody thought this would be easy, so they thought it would be a good idea to put him on that system. But unfortunately, it didn't really turn out to be easy for him. So in the retrospective, he had anticipated that they would tell him off for not being able to do it in the right way. And they were just completely surprised when he shared that expectation. And they said, oh, we didn't know, you should have told us. So actually that part of the system, now that you mention it, is a bit tricky to work with. Let us figure out how to help you. So he felt a lot better after the retrospective, and the system got a lot better. The last thing I want to share is learning to live with a vendor system. And I'll come back to that because that's got something to do with the goblin that I mentioned. When I go through a retrospective, I always think about the 5 stages of a retrospective that I learned from Diana Larsen and Esther Darby's brilliant book, Agile Retrospectives, Making Good Teams Great. One of the first things that you do in a retrospective is that you set the stage, you're getting ready. And here you might follow up on the action points that you decided at the last retrospective. Hopefully you follow up on them before the retrospective as well, maybe every Wednesday or something like that. But at least at the retrospective, you follow up on the action points you decided in the last one. Did we implement them? Did we get the impact that we hoped? And it's also here that if you have a specific theme for your retrospective, this is where you talk about it. Maybe it's the testing process you want to improve or the way that you're learning. This is also the time where you get everybody to share, everybody to say something. It can be a little silly thing. It doesn't have to be a great thing. It can just be what is a success they would like to share, or what did they take too seriously in the last sprint, or what did they not take seriously enough. Anything that makes them say anything makes it easier for them to say something in the long run. And since a retrospective is for a team to share, it's not meant to be just a presentation by one person. It's meant to be a discussion. The next part in the retrospective is where you gather data. For instance, you can have a timeline and you can put post-it notes on it, or maybe you have an online tool and you put virtual post-it notes on it, or you vote for different things, vote for how good the technical quality is or how good our communication are with the other teams. Gathering data can be done in many ways. You have the team radar, the ship retrospectives, all sorts of things. This is normally what people think about when they think about a retrospective, is this sharing of data. But it doesn't have to be feelings and post-it notes. It can also be burn down charts or feedback from customers or something like that. The next part is where you generate insights. And this is the difficult part in the retrospective, because this is where you try to make meaning of the data. This is where you try to say, okay, so this happened, but what actually caused this? Because this is a difficult part of the retrospective, and because it takes time, a lot of people who want to rush retrospectives to get them over as fast as possible actually skip this step. Let me show you an example. So I called the retrospective anti-pattern the Wheel of Fortune, and I'll come back to why I call it the Wheel of Fortune. Imagine that you have a team and they've been told that the retrospective should take 90 minutes, but they think that's too long. Maybe just an hour would be fine. And then when they see they can do it in an hour, they say, maybe half an hour is okay. And in the end, they have optimized the retrospective so that it's only 20 minutes. Sometimes they even brag about this. And is that a problem? Yes. And why? Well, let's see. Imagine one of these teams that wants to do the retrospective in 20 minutes. In the gathering data, they put up some posters, maybe start doing this, stop doing this, and continue doing this, or maybe even less of or more of. And then they have the brainstorm where they gather data and people put up post-it notes, and maybe they say we want more pair programming, we want less meetings, I hear that all the time. And maybe we want to paint the spot on the ceiling because there's a weird spot on the ceiling and we want to paint that. If you are wishing to rush a retrospective, you will just create action points based on this, right? So you say, okay, more pair programming. Well, we'll just schedule some pair programming, maybe 3 days a week with 80% of the team. And then we'll do that. And that might be a good solution if the problem actually was that they forgot to do pair programming. And that's often what happens when you rush from gathering data to deciding what to do, is that you forget to generate the insights, you forget to learn. Because if they spend a little bit more time trying to figure out why there was not as much pair programming as they hoped for, maybe they would learn that there are some causes behind this. Maybe a lot of the people are introvert, or maybe there's not enough psychological safety, or maybe they don't know how to do it remotely. There can be all sorts of reasons for not doing pair programming. Forgetting to do it is the only thing that will be solved by scheduling more of it. And actually, if you schedule more of it and there's no psychological safety, you can make the problem worse. And if we look at the thing about less meetings, as I said, I see this often, and people say, let's skip the daily meetings. We don't need those anymore, and let's only have every other retrospective or something like that. But again, if the cause is not the number of meetings, but the cause is the quality of the meetings, then cutting the number of meetings down will not help you, because you'll have fewer but still rubbish meetings, so they won't help you in any way, and they'll still be miserable to be in. It's a bit like painting the spot on the ceiling. Wouldn't it be better to figure out why there is a spot on the ceiling? Maybe there's some water coming in through the roof or something like that, and painting the spot will not make the problem go away, because that's only the symptom of the problem. It's not the cause of the problem. When you're in the Generate Insights phase, you can just have discussions like this, or you can do the 5 whys, or if you have enough time and you have a recurring problem, you can actually do an Ishikawa diagram or a fishbone diagram. Here's an example. So you draw a fishbone, like a skeleton of a fish on the board, and then you put the problem at the head. Maybe you miss the deadline over and over again, and you want to really dive into why you do that. So you brainstorm on the causes for missing the deadline. Maybe you have too much tech debt, so you can't build a system upon that. You have to change things all the time. Maybe it's poor prioritization, that you do the things that you should have, that are only nice to have instead of need to have, and then you end up having to do all the need to have at the end. Maybe the requirements are set too early, and then they're changed and you don't realize the changes because you're not doing agile. Maybe there's no motivation because we're not celebrating the small wins. So maybe somebody thinks that their desk is too small, and that could be the reason for not actually reaching the deadline. So I call this anti-pattern of wanting to rush through a retrospective, as we just saw here, for the Wheel of Fortune. And when I say a Wheel of Fortune, it's like when you go to a Tivoli and you spin that Wheel of Fortune and it says tick, 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 and sometimes you get a prize, but oftentimes you don't get anything. You just lose your money. And it's a bit the same if you rush through a retrospective. You might just solve the symptoms instead of the causes, and the cause is still there. The real problem is still there. Sometimes you're lucky, but sometimes you're not. So that's why generating insights is quite an important part of the stages of the retrospective. The next stage of the retrospective is deciding what to do, and most often what people do here is that they say, let's focus on one of the things, one of the issues or the problems that we talked about, and let's brainstorm for what we can do. There are myriads of ways for deciding what to do, what kind of decision process you do, what kind of activity you do. The important thing is to think about the fact that sometimes democracy is not the best way to do it, because you might have a majority that becomes very happy, but the minority might not become so happy. And if it's the same people always in the minority when you get to decide what to do, it's not very helpful for the team in the long run. The last thing you do is that you close the retrospective. It's quite important that you get a retrospective closed again, where you make sure that the action points that you've decided to have, or maybe you call them experiments because action points are a little bit too dangerous for the people. All these things, there is a name, somebody who's responsible for it. It can't just be the team who's responsible for it, because that will be forgotten. It has to be somebody who's responsible. It has to be a specific description of what it is, so that you can measure whether it was done or not at the next retrospective. And sometimes a deadline is a good idea. Sometimes the very first step is a good thing to talk about. This is the first thing. I'll send this email. I'll make this document. It makes it easier to get started if you have the first step very concretely described there. Sometimes I do a summary of the retrospective. I say, we discussed these things. This is what we chose to dive into. These are the action points we suggested, and this is what we ended up with, just so that people can see that there was actually a flow through the retrospective and we didn't just jump to conclusions and this is the problem that we want to solve. Or maybe sometimes we're talking about the good things and we're saying this is the thing that we want more of. Now the stages of a retrospective actually is the same as the same kind of stages of a meeting. So you start off with being in agreement about the topic of the meeting, hopefully. What is the success criteria? What do we want to talk about? And then you go into the divergence phase, where people are sharing opinions, sharing data, sharing experiences, and the facilitator then should be aware of keeping things within the borders of the meeting. So if some people are jumping out of that, they should be able to say, oh, that's a great discussion, but not for this meeting. Maybe we can put it on the parking lot over here. Divergence is a thing that needs to be supported so that people actually start sharing, that they feel safe enough to share. Some teams find it difficult to work with the divergence phase because they don't feel safe in sharing problems, they don't feel safe in sharing experiences, and then you have to help them in some ways. Other teams find it very easy to share, very easy to diverge, and in those cases the facilitator have to try to keep them on track. So your facilitation will depend very much on what kind of team you're working with. The next phase is the grown zone, or the grow zone, that some people call it, where you're sort of discussing things, and it's okay to disagree, and it's okay to see new relations between things. This is the place where you can be very creative. And a lot of the developers and engineers I've worked with, they struggle a bit with this grown zone because they want to jump into the convergence phase. They want to solve the problems because that's what they're very good at. In the convergence phase, as you can see, you are sort of chopping off the branches of the conversation graph or the conversation tree. And then you're saying, we're not discussing this, we're not discussing this. We're sort of converging towards some sort of decision or result from the meeting. So keeping the generate insight phase open is like keeping the grown zone open. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't solve the problems right now, because you don't know whether you're solving the problems or you're actually solving the symptoms. And the important thing is for you, when you're facilitating your team, to figure out what kind of team do you have, what do they actually need help with. Is it the divergence, the grown zone, or the convergence? Teams are different in that way. Another anti-pattern I want to talk about with retrospectives is called in the soup. So in the soup is depicted by this octopus trying to lift a weight. And the octopus is really trying to lift a weight with its tentacles, but unfortunately it cannot. And I see the octopus a little bit as a team trying to solve a problem here. So you know that in an octopus, 60% of its brain is in its tentacles. So an octopus is actually like 9 different animals working together, each with their own brain. So it's a bit like a team where everybody has their own brain, but together they're strong. But sometimes there are some things that a team cannot solve itself. And a lot of people see retrospectives as places where they can complain about things, where they can vent about things. And they definitely are places where you can share things. The unfortunate thing is when people continue to discuss the same things that they cannot change. And then it can become a waste of time. So in those cases, when I see a team sort of discussing the same thing over and over again that they cannot change, I offer them the soup activity that I also learned from Dana Larsen, where you say, well, let's take all the problems that we talked about and divide them into 3 different groups. The things that we can do something about, the things that we can influence or say something about, and the things that are in the soup. So it could be that we've gathered data on a timeline or a sales ship retrospective data gathering, and then we say, well, there are some things here that we might be able to do something about immediately, but also some things that we can't do anything about. And then let's take these post-it notes and put them into this activity. So it could be that we have too much tech debt, that's something we can do something about. And the communication with the testers is bad, that's something we can only influence, that's not something we can do something about. And then, as I heard from one of the teams that I am facilitating retrospectives for, they were irritated about the vendor, the software from the vendors, which made it very painful for them to do their work. And I noticed that they kept talking about these vendor systems and how difficult it was and how aggravating it was to work with these. So we tried to use the soup activity. And for instance, too much tech debt, we can come up with action points for that. But when we have something that's an influence, like the communication with the testers is bad, it might be a good idea to think about, is there any part of this problem that lies within the power of what we can do? And maybe one of the problems with the bad communications is that we are physically too far away from the testers, and maybe we need to do something about that. So you can sort of slice parts of the problem and maybe move them closer to the middle. When it comes to the software from the vendors that made it painful to do their work, I introduced the goblin that I talked about in the beginning. Now, what is the goblin? Well, when you have something that irritates you every day and you complain about it and you think you've tried everything to change it, at some point you just have to accept that it's there in your life, in the soup that you live in, and then find a way to laugh at it. So for me, it came with, in my long and wonderful marriage, my husband, when he had taken a shower in the morning, he would take the towel and hang it on the hook so that it could dry for the next day. But then unfortunately, the goblin would go into the bathroom, take the towel down, crumble it up and leave it in the wet pile on the floor. And we introduced this goblin at some point, maybe 10 years ago, because we decided, well, this is something that we cannot change. We might as well laugh about it. So almost every morning we're laughing about the goblin. I'm saying, oh, the goblin is there again. My husband says, oh, irritating goblin. Let me go do something with that towel now. And it just goes to say that if you have something that irritates you, instead of just becoming irritating, demanding person who just complains all the time and nobody wants to be with, maybe try laughing at the things that you can't change anyway. So I use the soup often in the gathering data, going towards the generating insights, but I also sometimes use it in the deciding what to do phase, because sometimes people brainstorm for a lot of things that they want to do, but if you choose an action point that you can't actually do something about yourself, you just become frustrated about that. So I sometimes use it after they've brainstormed about the different things that they want to change, and then I say, well, let's look at what we can actually change. We can code review all major changes, that's what we can do. Getting better meetings, probably something we can influence. Maybe we can find ways to do something about it, and changing the location of the company is not something we can do. But in the conversation about these things, maybe we can slice some things out that we can actually do. Maybe we can change the meeting culture. Maybe we can come up with the reasons for a local hub. So I call this in the soup antipattern, and it describes how the antipattern is that some teams discuss things that they cannot change over and over again and are wasting the time in the retrospectives, and the refactored solution is to use the soup activity to focus on the things that you can do and work consciously about the things that you cannot do anything about. Another antipattern that I want to share with you is prime directive ignorance, and it comes from the first book about retrospectives called Project Retrospectives by Norm Kurth, and he wrote this prime directive for retrospectives. Regardless of what we discover, we must understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job he or she could, given what was known at the time, his or her skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. And the trouble with this prime directive is that it can be very difficult for some people to truly believe that everybody did the best that they could. But here I want to go back to what I think a retrospective is. It's a chance to share, appreciate and learn, and to understand everything is to forgive everything. And that's also what Norm Kurth said when he introduced the prime directive, is that this is the mindset you should strive to have when you enter a retrospective, that everybody did the best they could. You could put this prime directive as a facilitator on a poster in the room. You can put it in the calendar invitation, or you can use your own words. Maybe just say, remember, we are not here to blame people. We're here to find faults in the system that we can optimize, where the system is the whole team and the communication. But unfortunately, if we ignore the prime directive, as in this anti-pattern, if we don't talk about it, sometimes it becomes a blaming game. I want to talk about a few more retrospective anti-patterns. Another one is called the loudmouth, and you probably, not you of course, but you probably know somebody who likes to talk all the time. And in retrospectives that's not very helpful, because the point of a retrospective is not that somebody gives a presentation, but that everybody gets a chance to share and communicate and appreciate these things. There are some people who really need to talk a lot. Some people are active thinkers. They need to talk in order to think. You can also hear it when they start talking that they haven't thought first. And then you have the silent ones, the people who need to think in the quiet place on their own before they can start talking. And one of the things that you can do to get out of the loudmouth antipattern is to go away from all the plenary discussions. Instead of having everybody saying like what they want in an open discussion, that's great for the loudmouths, but not very nice for the silent thinkers. So maybe do some more silent writing on post-it notes or in chats or online, and maybe divide people up in smaller groups, maybe talk 2 and 2 or in smaller groups. Makes it easier for the silent ones to say something, and also diminishes the contamination of the loudmouths talking to the others. Another one I want to talk about is the do-it-yourself antipattern, because it's often so that, for instance, if you do Scrum, a lot of people say that it's the Scrum Master that should facilitate all the retrospectives. And I understand all the reasons why. But when you facilitate all the retrospectives yourself, you don't get to have a retrospective yourself. You don't get to actually go into the discussions, because if you join the discussions in the retrospective, you forget to be a good facilitator. And the facilitator should always think about what's the energy in the room, who has said a lot, who hasn't said anything. Are we able to do it within the allotted time? If we spend some more time and gather data, can we shave some time on decide what to do or generate insights? If we go into this generating insights discussion, how quickly can we close down the last part of the retrospective? As a facilitator, you have so many things to think about that you can't really afford to go into the discussions. And if you go into the discussions, you forget your duty as a facilitator, and suddenly you go over time, or you can't finish in the right way, you don't get any action points out of it. One of the things that you can do is that you can swap within the team, that maybe somebody from the team will say, oh, I could facilitate the next retrospective. 2 good things come from this. One is that you get to relax and be part of the team, so you get a retrospective, but also they see that it's actually not that easy to facilitate a retrospective well. It's simple to facilitate a retrospective, but it's not easy to do well. Another thing you can do, if you have a bigger organization and you have a number of people who wants to facilitate retrospectives and are able to do it, you can do what we did in one of the companies that I worked with, is that we have a shared resource where we can see what are the teams that need retrospectives and at what points in time do they need it, and then who are the facilitators, who can we invite to facilitate our retrospectives. So this is something that you can do if you have like a bunch of teams, but remember that what happens in the retrospective stays in the retrospective. So don't use it as a way to laugh about other teams' misfortunes. If you do online retrospectives, I can recommend the Nitro.io tool for facilitating retrospectives online. If somebody wants to facilitate retrospectives who are not that experienced, it's a wonderful tool that you can easily choose different retrospective types, and then it tells you exactly what to do. Now they should write something on post-it notes, now they should vote, now we should move on to the next phase. So there's a lot of help in here and a lot of templates that you can just use. So that is your do-it-yourself retrospective anti-pattern, where I would suggest that you don't do it yourself all the time. Now the last anti-pattern that I want to talk about in this is called disregard for preparation. And that's because with all the online retrospectives that are out there, I think that some people maybe do not respect how long it actually takes to prepare an online retrospective. What I do normally is that I prepare the board already after the last retrospective, and then I send an email the day before to the team with the link to the board and say, remember to check that you can actually enter this, and if you want to add some things in the data gathering, you can do that already. Sometimes I send that a week before so that they can add things on a real time in the board. And then I send an email 15 minutes before where I say, remember there's a retrospective in 15 minutes, and you can schedule these in your mail program. Remember to get a bio break and a cup of coffee, and then insist on video for all. I know that there are some people who say, and there are some books out there saying how terrible and how hard it can be to be on video all day. But I'm just saying that in retrospectives, when you are facilitating, it's quite important for you to be able to use that as your tool to see whether people are angry, whether they really want to say something, or whether they've simply fallen asleep and you need to move on to the next. There will be some people who find it very awkward and difficult to be on video. Talk to people one-on-one. Don't call them out with all the other people. Have people not having to be on video if they really need it, but try to see if you can get as many as possible to be on video. And then don't record it, really. I mean, please do not record it. So I'm hoping that after this very short talk about what can go wrong and what you should do to avoid these things going wrong, I hope that when you facilitate retrospectives now, people will love the retrospectives that you facilitate. But just to remind you what we went through, then remember to solve the problems, not the symptoms. Spend time on generating insights. Make sure that you're on the same page. Talk about the things that you talk about instead of just running through the different concepts and questions. When somebody asks a question, repeat the question and say, this is what I heard you say, and then you can answer the question. Allow time for small talk and preparation before you start the meeting. A retrospective is a very focused session with a team, so you can't afford to really stop and spend 5 minutes on small talk even, because then you don't have enough time to go through all the phases. So try to get rid of the small talk before, maybe go into the meeting, start the meeting 5 minutes before, or go to the room if it's in real life 5 minutes before, and talk to the people who need some small talk before you start a meeting. Some people really like to talk about something else before the meeting starts, and some people just need to go directly to what the meeting is about when they show up. Focus on what you can do. Remember the soup antipattern. Don't spend a lot of time discussing things that you can't change. It's okay to vent, it's okay to talk about it, but if it's repeatedly the same things, then try to get rid of it. And then deal with the things that you cannot change. Just find a way to laugh at it. Find a way to say, this is okay. And make it safe for people to speak up. Try when you are setting the stage to have some humor in there, to talk about things that are a little bit silly. That makes it easier for people to speak up later. And then have a meeting facilitator for each and every meeting that you have. Not just the retrospectives, but all your meetings. Make sure that you have somebody who's committed to make this meeting worth the while. And of course, I want to also plug my book, Retrospectives Antipatterns, with the subtitle Avoid My Mistakes, that I wrote during COVID. So there's a lot of antipatterns and ways to avoid these antipatterns, and a lot of generic things about meeting facilitation. So I hope you have enjoyed it, and I hope to talk to you in real life at some point. Goodbye.